Let me try that again. Good morning and welcome to the Daily Cyber. Anybody would think that I was just a professional at this stuff, wouldn't they? Goodness me. Good morning and welcome to the Daily Cyber Briefing for Wednesday, the 28th of June. Interesting article that I came across on Ars Technica this morning that talks about a previously unseen Mac malware. It's been dubbed Joker Spy and is written in Python. Okay. It's interesting, mainly because I hadn't come across it to make you aware of these things too, as I come across them. But it is also interesting because it uses SwiftBelt in order to enumerate information from the infected host. Now, SwiftBelt is it's a piece of open source software that is used by security professionals to test Mac devices for vulnerabilities. Has various capabilities, quite useful tool. But one of the things it does is it can kind of enumerate all sorts of features, aspects of a device, which in this case is then used to feed the malware with information. So the starting point is an executable file called XCC, which gets downloaded or gets run from users shared on the Mac. To overwrite the contents of the TCC database. Now, if you've used Macs, you'll know that there are the usual BSD type permissions on files, which are all well and good and have worked well for donkey's years and are very well implemented in BSD and very well implemented in macOS as well. However, Apple have layered over that controls around which apps can access which other apps or which other devices on your Mac. So, for example, if you've got some kind of anti-malware scanner, it will at some point ask for permissions to read the entire disk. If an app tries to access a camera, it will then prompt it will prompt the user for permissions to allow the app to access the camera. Which is actually very useful. It means that it is noticeably harder for apps to inadvertently do things like turn your camera on, at least by using kind of the simple legitimate steps within the operating system in order to do these things. So one of the things that this particular piece of malware does then is it tries to overwrite that database in such a way that the parts of the system that it wants to touch will appear to have already granted the app permission for those, which will reduce or hopefully the idea I think was to eliminate pop-ups saying XCC or whatever wants to access your hard disk or whatever it may be. So basically, I think it does this by copying I think it copies with one of its own, one provided by itself. Then after that, it then downloads and installs the main malware, which is sh.py. And that's the kind of the main engine for the Joker Spy malware. It has quite comprehensive backdoor capabilities. It can execute and return commands from a shell. It can list paths. It can upload, download files, execute Python code. Built-in base 64 Python code it can decode base 64 encoded Python code, okay, built into it, and then use and compile and execute that. It can remove files. It's a very sophisticated. Very sophisticated. It's very functional, I think is probably better to say. Piece of malware. It's still uncertain how the initial compromise is undertaken. How does XCC get into users shared? They're looking into that, according to the article that I have been reading. Sure, they'll find that. They think it's possibly related to QR codes and so on and so forth. So, but they're not totally sure. Anyway, it makes an interesting read. It's also very interesting to see the functionality of the final malware, backdoor malware, because this kind of gives an indication as to what the attackers thought they might be able to do with it. So, Android, not specifically that Android is a problem. It isn't. Android does allow particular sorts of software which basically enables people to track things going. The idea being things like parental controls and employer controls, that whatever it might be. One of those, I mean, they're broadly categorized as stalkerware, which is a bit creepy, but it's kind of how they're referred to, these bits of software that may end up on your device. However, so one of them is even more creepily called Let Me Spy. So it's unfortunate that Let Me Spy data has now been leaked. So yeah, the data that has been collected through this particular solution, at least some of it, has now been leaked via, I think via text messages actually, but around 10,000 phones were registered for this particular spyware, although not all of them apparently. And the app seems to work on Androids 4 to 7. So if you're not using those particular versions, then you should be okay. But the purloined data includes call logs, messages, geolocations, IP addresses, payment logs, user IDs, email addresses, accounts and password hashes, and so on. So it does seem that, well, firstly, it is a bit, I understand the need for parental controls, but this demonstrates that if you're using this sort of software, somebody else, not just you, somebody else is gathering a vast amount of information about your kids. Or if you're an employer, you may be using this if well, actually, let's be completely blunt about this. If you don't know what your employees are doing, that's a managerial issue, not a technical issue. You don't have to look somebody in the eye or stand behind them looking at what they're typing, or give them permission to have a cup of coffee at a particular time. So installing spyware on people's work devices, I think, is one of those dubious practices that just reeks of inability to manage, from my perspective. But there we go. Some organisations seem to think that the way to motivate people is to spy on them. Well, I don't particularly agree with that. And we sure as hell don't do that sort of stuff. However, it does mean that, though, if you have put this stuff on your corporate devices and it then gets nicked, you've just spread all your stuff around more. You've increased your threat surface quite considerably. So yeah, if you have been a user of Let Me Spy, just be aware the data has been leaked. And you may want to put in place of all sorts of private and secret information that may have been leaked. What do you want to do with it? Finally, from me, in the category of so unlikely I don't believe it's a coincidence, a company has found lost SSDs and their confidential data for sale on eBay. So 4 SSD disks are alleged to have gone missing from SAP during a particular event in last November. The disks managed to make their way out of a secure data center into an insecure office, and were then taken without permission. Remarkably, an individual from the company appears to have found the discs, or at least one of them, being sold on eBay, and bought it, and it turned out, yes, to be one of the missing discs. You could put this down to the hope it turns up somewhere type approach, or more likely there's something a little bit dubious going on in the background. So yeah, what happens to stuff physical stuff when it gets nicked? Well, it mostly gets sold on eBay. So yes, interesting one that. It is quite nice then that personal records of certain employees have now been returned, although goodness only knows what happened to them in the meantime. Make sure you keep track of hardware. Getting stuff in and out of data centers can be remarkably difficult, especially if you're trying to do it legitimately. But it does appear that if you're doing it illegitimately, it isn't so difficult to do after all. We kind of, in the world of it's all in the cloud, we sort of forget stuff like how to make sure that your data center is secure. Well, it still matters, and in fact it probably matters more than you realize, because your data is now in somebody else's data center, and you have no control at all over who has physical access to it. If it's with Amazon or Google or whoever it might be, and that's one of the reasons why certainly in some sectors there was an initial reluctance for the uptake of cloud, and actually why in some sectors there's serious discussions about bringing stuff back from the cloud and putting them back into managed data centers again, because at least then you have control to some extent over what's going on. That's all from me today. I hope you have a great Wednesday, and I will speak to you all again